being recorded, please let me know. Uh, and we'll make whatever adjustments that we need to make. Okay, my name is Jan. I want to welcome everyone, especially our guest speaker this evening, Lex Musta. His topic this evening is Indigenous Allyship, the example of Ruhiyyh Khanum. And we'll be hearing a lot more about this great lady, I'm sure. For those of you who might be joining for the first time, and I know there are a few first-timers here, the purpose of these firesides is to introduce principles and teachings of the Baha'i faith and to consider how they might be applied to the conditions in the world, the circumstances, the difficulties that we are having in the world today, which are very numerous. So what we want to do is to start with a devotional, and I want to thank Jale for preparing the devotional this evening. Jale, thank you so much. We'll be starting with a musical presentation of a prayer for humanity, greatly needed. All of humanity, all of us need lots of prayer. That will be followed by an Indigenous American prayer that will be shared by Jale, and then Gillian will be sharing a passage from the Baha'i writings. So now we will go ahead and get started with our video here.
O thou kind Lord, thou hast created all humanity from the same stock. Thou hast decreed that all shall belong to the same household. In thy holy presence, they're all thy servants, and all mankind are sheltered beneath thy tabernacle. All have gathered together at thy table of bounty, and all are illumined through the light of thy providence. O God, thou art kind to all, thou hast provided for all, dost shelter all, conferrest life upon all. Thou hast endowed each and all with talents and faculties, and all are submerged in the ocean of thy mercy. O thou kind Lord, unite all, let the religions agree, and make the nations one, so that they may see each other as one family, and the whole earth as one home. May they all live together in perfect harmony. O God, raise aloft the banner of the oneness of mankind. O God, establish the most great peace. Cement thou, O God, the hearts together. O thou kind Father God, gladden our hearts through the fragrance of thy love. Brighten our eyes through the light of thy guidance. Delight our ears with the melody of thy word, and shelter us all in the stronghold of thy providence. Thou art the mighty and powerful. Thou art the forgiving, who overlooketh the shortcomings of all mankind.
O Great Spirit, creator of all things, human beings, trees, grass, berries, help us be kind to us. Let us be happy on earth. Let us lead our children to a good life and old age. These are people give them good minds to love one another. O Great Spirit, be kind to us. Give these people the favor to see green trees, green grass, flowers, and berries this next spring. So we all meet again, O Great Spirit, we ask of you.
Jolly John, do you have it for me on the screen? Because I don't have it. Did you send it to me?
Oh, I'm sorry, but I will do it right now.
Okay, I'll get it.
Sorry about that.
I can go ahead if it's going to take a little bit of time.
I'm sorry about that. I don't know what happened. Why don't I go ahead and read it? I'm very sorry, having difficulty here.
Much better.
Sorry. O thou who art the Lord of Lords, I testify that thou art the Lord of all creation and the educator of all beings, visible and invisible. I bear witness that thy power hath encompassed the entire universe, and that the hosts of the earth can never dismay thee, nor can the dominion of all peoples and nations deter thee from executing thy purpose. I confess that thou hast no desire except the regeneration of the whole world and the establishment of the unity of its people and the salvation of all them that dwell therein. Baha'u'llah.
Thank you so much, Shale.
Thank you.
Well, I'd like to take just a moment to introduce our speaker this evening. Lex Musta is an independent researcher whose work focuses on the role of social meanings in shaping race relations. He completed his MBA studies in Paris at Schiller International University. His latest publication is an essay on Baha'i approaches to social change, co-authored with Dr. Roshan Danesh, published in Dimensions of Baha'i Law, which was a link with your invitation. He launched and spearheads DC time travel tours. Now, I'd like to give you just a little of my observations about Lex. He is a passionate humanitarian, a committed social activist and historian, a compelling storyteller, author, writer. He works sacrificially and tirelessly for restorative justice and is an extraordinary human being of great energy and great compassion, and is very humble. He podcasts on racial amity at The Other Tradition, also a link with your invitation, and he gives race amity tours through DC Travel Tours. Lex, thank you so much. We look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you, for coming, and Jan, thank you for having us in your fireside today. I want to be clear that I'm not speaking tonight about Indigenous Baha'i history or Indigenous Baha'i experience. We have many Indigenous Baha'i experts to speak on such topics, such as Dr. Little Brave Beeston, who we're honored to have here tonight, who spoke at this fireside in January. My talk is about my own ignorance of Indigenous issues and how transformative I found Indigenous allyship to be for myself. And I indeed believe that the Baha'i faith recommends Indigenous allyship to all of us. And so that'll be the topic for tonight's talk. As I said, I grew up very ignorant of the Indigenous life experience that surrounded me. Within 1 hour of the home I grew up, There were Chippewa, Mississauga, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Seneca, Tuscarora, and Lenape First Nations. And I didn't know any of them. Indeed, every weekend I would drive through the Mohawk Nation up in Bala, Ontario. If any of you are familiar with Canada, it's called the Muskoka region. And also, I was ignorant of them. And today I'm very grateful that I'm a guest here on this Indigenous land of the Monacan First Nation. And I'm so grateful to be in their territory. It's beautiful. Natural Bridge is this huge rock structure on this territory that towers 100 feet above the ground. Beautiful animals and mountains and trees. They have a beautiful burial cemetery that overlooks the mountains on the western edge of their territory at these wonderful headwaters of the Roanoke. Beautiful, beautiful land. And I'm very grateful to be presenting to you and to be their guest here for you. And I'd like to start with a brief story of how I came to understand that there is such a thing as Indigenous allyship. It was quite recently in my life. In 2012, I was attending a Race Amity conference in Boston. And at this Race Amity conference, I was sitting down after we gave some talks with two co-presenters, Douglas White of the Nanaimo First Nation and Dr. Roshan Danesh. And so we were sitting down, and Doug made a very remarkable comment that I'll never forget. He said, "Lex, right now, here, I'm with the first two people in my life who are not Indigenous, who I felt loved me." And for me, this was absolutely a stunning moment. Because on the one hand, I was asking, how is this possible? We have 30 million people in Canada, and Doug White is very well known. And how have they not expressed their love to him? And then, of course, I had to right away say, wait a second, why is this the first person who I very overtly made aware of my love for them, who's of an Indigenous background? So I had to ask myself that same question. Why was I so ignorant? Why did I have so little curiosity? And so I needed Doug's friendliness, his kindness and thoughtfulness to awaken this opportunity for mutual advancement together with people who are literally the standard bearers of the Baha'i faith. The Baha'i faith was established in Persia in 1844, and it further developed in 1863 with the dispensation of Baha'u'llah. And the Baha'i faith's pivot is to create a consciousness of the oneness of humankind, begin an era of global justice, equality, and unity. And a standard bearer is that means the chief representative. So the Indigenous people are the chief representatives to the whole world of the Baha'i faith. So only as high and only as expansively prestigious and influential are the Indigenous cultures of the world, only so much will the Baha'i faith be represented, and will the banner of equality and peace and justice be raised. So the stakes could literally not be higher for all of us to help advance and recognize and acknowledge the Indigenous nations of the world. And therefore, Indigenous allyship falls upon all of us, because as standard bearers of our faith, it is incumbent upon each of us to do everything we can to support them in their great work. So let's just take a break here. You'll notice that I recognize that I live in the Monacan National Territory here. I was wondering if any of you are aware of the Indigenous nation on whose territory you are a guest. And I'm going to share with you a map of your region just to help you in case you're not quite familiar with that. Is anyone aware of the indigenous nation that they're a guest of today as they're joining the Zoom?
I am with you in the land of the Monacans.
Wonderful. Isn't it beautiful?
Yes, indeed.
I live in Henrico, and I would like to know what is the closest indigenous reservation that I can go to visit.
Well, if you look on the map here, you see the Monacan River coming through here.
Yeah.
And then up here is the Mattaponi River and the Pamunkey River. So you can just go, you see Richmond,
Yes.
and Henrico falls on the border between Monacan territories and the territory of the Powhatan Nation. And so Highway 95 runs right along here. And so you have all these Indian nations, indigenous nations right here along the highway. And
How
so,
far from Richmond?
sorry?
How far is from Richmond, from where I live?
Oh, you can get there in 45 minutes.
45 minutes. Okay.
But Richmond itself sits on the frontier between the Monacan and the Powhatan nations.
A friend of mine who live in West Point have contact with some reservation indigenous there. And we're planning to go next Saturday to visit them. We're interested to make connection and build friendship with them. I think it's very important for the civilization to get engaged and connected with all people, all humanity in the world.
That's right. That's right. That's wonderful. Anyone else want to share which indigenous nation they're a guest of tonight?
You know, I'm not very good with maps, Lex. I knew I grew up on Penobscot territory in Maine. I was just a few miles from the reservation there. By looking at this map, although I'm not very good at maps, I think it's this Piscataway.
Yeah, Piscataway, nation of the south.
Like, yeah, where I might be located on the map?
Yeah, the Piscataway Nation has a wonderful exhibit for you to get to know them at and of course in DC, you all are close to the North American Museum, Native American Museum in Washington, DC, and they have a whole floor dedicated to the Piscataway there.
Wonderful, thank you.
And so one of the, let me just stop sharing for a moment. So one story that I want to share with you speaks to allyship. And in 2014 at the Association for Baha'i Studies conference, Dr. Roshan Danesh was given permission to share a story by the hereditary chief, Michael Leach, who some of you might know, of the chief of the Sadeghian people in British Columbia. And so I want to play that video. It's a very short video, about a minute long. And it talks about indigenous allyship and an example of it by a member of the Universal House of Justice. In the Baha'i faith, we elect 9 individuals to lead the faith at a kind of a global level. And Ali Nakjavani was a former member of the Universal House of Justice. And he came specifically to meet with the indigenous nations, friends of British Columbia, And in a closed door 2-day session, it was just himself and his wife, Violet Nakjavani, and they met with the indigenous. And this story comes from that remarkable meeting in 2008. And I want you to hear it from Roshan, and then we're going to talk about it a little bit. So let me just share that with you. All right.
Attendees at that meeting, very special meeting, was a hereditary chief of the Statliam people, a people who've lived in the interior of British Columbia for countless generations, a hereditary chief named Michael Leach. And he tells this very short anecdote, this short story of that gathering. He says, "I was taken to the Vancouver Baha'i Center located on Main Street in Vancouver. Mr. Ali Nakjavani and Violet Nakjavani were present. He talked about the importance of the American Indian. After his presentation, he embraced me and whispered in my ear, 'Help us.'"
And let me just escape out of this. And so what's interesting, well, there's many things interesting about it, but this notion of allyship is really central to the Baha'i faith with the indigenous. And it comes straight from the tablets of the divine plan, which we'll talk a little bit about, which guided the Baha'i community in its expansion and growth. And it comes right to Amatul Ruhiyyh Khanum, who was a hand of the cause of God in the Baha'i faith, a position of great importance. And it extends all the way to the Nakjavanis coming across the oceans to visit with the indigenous nations here and tell them, help us. And of course, we should know, take some time to discuss this, because help us is sort of the opposite of what we have been taught, right? We've all been taught a history of helping you, the indigenous people of Canada and America, where these successor states were created, are in need of help. And this is in the very kind of fundamental documents of this country. This notion that we're going to assimilate you. We're going to, this whole country was empty. You know, we talk about things like we settled the West. You know, it was just a country waiting empty for us to just settle it. And so this notion of doctrine of discovery has poisoned the way we think. And similarly, the notion that, you know, we have to bring education and we have to bring teaching. We have to help you. But the actual term that Ali Nakjavani used was help us, which is the opposite of this. So we have to explore this a little bit together. You know, for instance, this notion of this potato here, I love this as an example. It seems like such a simple thing to us, but this is a great example of very advanced food technology, which was completely unknown in Persia or in England or Germany, because it was domesticated in the Americas. And this potato is 20 times more efficient than wheat at creating food energy for humans. And if you look at the population explosion in Europe, it absolutely coincides with the indigenous nations of the Americas sharing the potato with Europeans, and allowed each farmer to create 20 times more food on their same amount of acreage, which allowed them to feed animals and to explode their populations. So this is an example of saying how this notion of help us, there's so much to that notion. And let's start off with this notion of assimilation. So in the very founding document of this country of America is there merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. So in the very founding document of this country, we have a document of absolute destruction of you know, that there's nothing there for us. We have to help them. We have to assimilate them. They have nothing to offer us. We have to just control them and civilize them. And of course, that led to the horrible destruction of residential schools. 150 residential schools were set up in the Americas. And Carlisle, Captain Richard Pratt set the standard in 1892. Here's a picture from that school. This is north of Baltimore in Pennsylvania, Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And here was his speech at his commencement speech of his own school in 1892. He said, "A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one, and that high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man." Unbelievable. That shocking statement referred to a great general. The great general who he was talking to was General Philip Sheridan, who was talking to this gentleman. This is Chief Tokawash from the Panateca Comanche First Nation. And Chief Tokawash went to the general and said, "I am a good Indian." He was trying to begin a relationship with this representative of the US government who was coming into his Comanche First Nation. And the general replied, as was just quoted to you, he didn't like that he said this, "I'm a good Indian." He said, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian." So this horrible starting of relationships between the Comanche and US government speaks to a very, very sad time, of course, because you know, this gentleman was trying to start a proper government-to-government relationship, and instead he was forcibly resettled to Oklahoma, and the treaty that resettled them to Oklahoma was broken as people invaded there and took the land that they had for themselves there as well away from them. So that whole notion of assimilation, taking away their land, taking away their culture, you know, kill the Indian and save the man, this notion that they have nothing to offer, we have to save them from themselves. So that goes deep, deep into the American psyche. The other aspect of it, besides assimilation, is denial. And that is that we kind of deny that these indigenous peoples are even here. And of course, every single law student to this day in America, on their first day of law school, they learn about the case, 1823 case of Johnson versus Mintosh. And this is the landmark decision where the US Supreme Court looked back to 1609. And the US Supreme Court said, the King James of England said that under the Great Seal of England, we did establish the rights of soil and jurisdiction. So basically what they're saying is, wherever we go, we take jurisdiction because there's no one there. This notion of terra nullius, that there's nobody here. Indigenous people aren't here, so therefore we have rights of soil and jurisdiction. And so in 1823, a US Supreme Court referenced that document to deny any treaty, any title of indigenous people in America. And then we saw this pipeline, which this picture is of, in Standing Rock, which brought together 100 indigenous nations to work together to oppose this pipeline through their territory. And you hear today in the news, President Biden said they can't take the pipeline, and then you hear people wishing to still put the pipeline through? Do they refer to the treaties? Do they refer to the indigenous rights? Or all you hear them say is jobs, economic exploitation of the land? You never hear them even mention the indigenous, the people who say, get the pipeline going again. And as you can see, these policemen went against undefended men, women, children, and elders, and even sprayed them with freezing water in the middle of winter and so on, as all those images you're probably familiar with. So this is the absolute notion of denial. And my daughter, who's here, she had a good example of denial. It's not just taught at our law schools. She was on a school field trip to Stanton, Virginia. And I had to watch as my daughter had to hear that the teacher there said, you know why this area here in Stanton, Virginia got invaded? It got invaded for cheap land. Cheap land? Why is it cheap? Because it's the Monacan nation's land that was being taken. It wasn't cheap. It was just being taken without recompense. So I had to confront this school and say, why are you teaching my daughter things that are wrong? You're teaching my daughter denial, that this land was just sitting here empty, waiting to be purchased cheap. And so as a way to attempt to restore the situation, we were able to go into the class for a number of weeks and teach, about some of the actual indigenous culture of this area to Adisu and her classmates, because I didn't want my daughter to learn and go unchallenged this notion of denial that the Monacan nation doesn't exist. So since Adisu's age, all the way up through law school, you get taught assimilation and denial. And this has poisoned many of our minds, certainly my own. It manifests itself in two ways: ignorance and passivity. So most of us are completely ignorant of anything to do with the indigenous peoples around us. And then most of us are passive because we are expecting them just to kind of go away and just become Americans because they have nothing to offer us, we've been taught. So the real damage of that is that ignorance and passivity then characterize our relationship with the indigenous, as it did mine until my 40s, which is very, very sad. And so I hope my daughter obviously is going to have a very different life than the one I had. So one of the things that we come from this belief that at the end of the day, our way's better and their way goes away. So that's why the notion of help us completely flips that. We have much to learn from the indigenous, right? We have much to learn from the Monacans. We have much to learn from all indigenous nations. And so how are we going to go and move into an era where we're going to replace our ignorance and passivity and our polluted way of thinking? So the prerequisite for unity, Baha'u'llah has taught us, is justice. So let's shift back to the Baha'i example of allyship to contrast this with what the greater society teaches us. And so I want to start off with this notion of allyship. And in the Tablets of Divine Plan, which I referred to earlier, there's a statement which is really instructive for us. And Abdu'l Baha writes, he's the son of Baha'u'llah. He was the leader of the Baha'i faith in 1917 when he wrote this. He said, attach great importance to the indigenous population of America, for these souls may be likened unto the ancient inhabitants of the Arabian Peninsula, who prior to the mission of Muhammad were like unto savages. When the light of Muhammad shone forth in their midst, however, they became so radiant as to illumine the world. Likewise, these Indians, should they be educated and guided, there can be no doubt that they will become so illuminated as to enlighten the whole world. And at first glance, you might think this is another help you statement, where Baha'is are coming here to help the indigenous in a paternalistic way with assimilation and denial. But listen to it very carefully. It's actually the opposite of that. At this time, there were no indigenous communities in America. So this letter was written to Persian and European descent Baha'is. And it was a critique of assimilation and denial, because it takes the most powerful example that exists in America of a community that is most oppressed and most unseen, and elevates them to the status of our future, the standard bearers of our faith, the representatives of our faith. So it directly challenges denial and assimilation, because it makes us see them, recognize them, and then work for mutual advancement. So I wanted to ask you all, do you have any examples that come to your mind of somebody who's a real role model of indigenous allyship? I'd love to hear some of the people in your life who've inspired you with their indigenous allyship. Jan, do they have to hit the mute button, or are they able to?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably most everybody's on mute. You may, if you want to speak, you will have to
Okay.
unmute
I was
you.
just saying that the only thing I know is about myself, that whenever I get something in the mail that they ask for some donation, I usually do a little bit of donation, but that's about it. I wish I could do more.
Yeah, there's definitely people who need help right now. The Diné Nation is really suffering with COVID. I'm sure if anybody has some charitable money, the Diné Nation would especially appreciate it right now.
Jan?
Yes,
I'm a
Ronaldo.
bit too surprised of our muteness. Is I think the majority of us, at least I and Patricia, we don't have any type of example of what Lex is asking, because we're as ignorant as he was for many, and still are for many, what's happening to indigenous people all around the world.
The only example I can think of, Lex, would probably be my sister, but I don't think it's at the depth that you're talking about. She's a state legislator in Maine, and she represents, I know I've mentioned this a number of times, I think when you were here before, she was here and had mentioned this, but she represents the Passamaquoddy Nation, 2 reservations in Maine. And she works very closely with the chief there, who represents the Passamaquoddies in the state legislature, but they have no vote. So she actually is the voting representative for the Passamaquoddy Nation, but she's working very hard now to have the Passamaquoddy representative to be able to vote on behalf of the Passamaquoddy Nation. So you know, she's doing a lot more than I can share at this time, but you know, she's very devoted to making their representation much more authentic and effective.
Yeah, you know, I often think about how we have 500, you know, languages around us, you know, real native North American languages. And I one time went to learn the Quechua language of Peru, and the person who was teaching me, you know, they were so curious why I wanted to learn the language, and I said, well, you know, it seems to me that I live in this continent, I should speak some of the continent's languages. And they got so excited by that this man Vladimir, he went back to a city he comes from in Bolivia called Puca Puca, which means red. And he because he was in America to try to earn money for his family, but then he decided to go back there to help raise his sons and take care of his family and to help raise his culture there. So it was quite an inspiration to learn from him. And I look forward to visiting with him. But the example I wanted to share on the screen here, you see that in America, we have a very close relationship between the African descent community and the indigenous community, such as the Seminole, where they were given refuge from enslavement and they formed a joint culture. And Barbara Talley is such an example for me of an indigenous ally. She held the first ever conference in America of the people of African descent and indigenous descent. And they held a conference, a 5-day conference over Thanksgiving. And I thought it was so beautiful. Normally Thanksgiving, people don't know how to celebrate this holiday because there's such moments of sadness and Christopher Columbus and so on. And here she made this conference, and I watched the conference, and for the first time I got to see indigenous Baha'i speaker after indigenous Baha'i speaker after indigenous Baha'i speaker. And it was so elevating and so much to learn, and such a wonderful example. And I know how hard Barbara worked to bring that together and to try to find out who all should come together and to create such a forum. I was extremely inspired by that. And so I know Barbara Talley is still continuing in such work. But to many of your points, Ronaldo, thank you for saying that, we were ignorant, and therefore it's hard to be an ally as the denial and the assimilation is in your mind. So you're not even looking to become an ally.
Alex, excuse me, but in answer to your question, if there are any examples, yes. My husband Lucho is from Bolivia. He's right here next to me. I'm just put a little context. He grew up in a very remote part of Bolivia among the Quechua speaking people, and that's why he does speak Quechua. We did go back into, 1991, took our children to live there as pioneers and lived there for the next 15 years. Lucho was able to, with his Quechua language, work with the Peace Corps and go into the Quechua speaking country, and I think did a great service for his, in the name of the Peace Corps in his own country. But I did want to say his father, we have many stories of the Baha'is in Bolivia among the indigenous people. But one thing is when Lucho was young, and I'll just start this story. I don't know if he wants to tell the rest of it, and we don't have to be long. But his father's from Lebanon. It's a complicated story, but they had indigenous people working on their farm with them. And so when Lucho had to go to school, when he went to school, his father insisted that he take these young little indigenous people of the children of the family who worked for them and in hand and took them to school. And of course, they didn't have the Spanish language at the beginning and things were a little complicated, but I don't know, did you want to add to that story or?
Well, yeah, and that town where I grew up was very much discrimination against the indigenous, as you were saying earlier. So we were obligated to take these young children to the school because they were Indians. They were not treated properly. And because we were foreigners, we were not treated properly either, because my father being Lebanese. So we had a double discrimination there, but we made it. And you were saying about Puka Puka. We work with the Puka Puka people and school the Puka Puka.
The Baha'is.
With the Baha'is. As the stories are long, just another thing I did is the National Assembly of Bolivia asked me to consolidate all the properties of the Baha'i properties in Bolivia. While I was doing that, I come up in one place in Potosi where Ruhiyyh Khanum walked. So I walk in her footprints and learn a lot of stories about her. And of course, everything was in Quechua. So we have quite a few stories about indigenous, and in this country, I was hired by the state and federal government, and I worked with the Seneca Nation. So as you see, I mix quite a few things, so I'm not going to make any longer. I should stop there.
That's wonderful. Can you share if it's true? Puka Puka was deciding how can we pay for the first ever Quechua language school so the children don't have to go discriminated against in a Spanish-speaking school. And I heard the story that the city is about 1/3 Baha'i, 1/3 evangelical, 1/3 Catholic, and each of the groups gave up alcohol, and the money they used to spend on alcohol, they contributed to this school. Is there any truth to that story?
I do not know that story, but what I know is about the Puka Puka is one little village, and surrounding villages are not even villages. They just few houses. I don't know what you call. We call them. And Puka Puka, the majority of Puka Puka people were Baha'is.
That was the last we heard, that the majority of, we've been there, we heard that the majority of them are Baha'is. I don't know, if our information is more updated or what, but.
But the last thing is that because the school was funded by the federal government to pay the teachers, and this school was not receiving any money, but the Baha'is were raising their own money to pay their own teachers to teach in Spanish and Quechua. And I think like 5 years ago, the government took the school back. So now the Puka Puka school is back to the government, but the Baha'is, they still. We know at least 3 Puka Puka Indians, they come to be professionals, and we knew from children, and now they're professionals, and they're helping and teaching this Baha'i school, separate from the old school, which the government took over. And as you said, you were learning Quechua. So if you want to put a few words whenever you're comfortable with, I would like to hear it.
Ima sutiki Lex.
No hay pata suti lucho.
Anyway, I have a prayer. I learned Quechua. I'll do that a little later.
And I only wanted to maybe end here with that. I consider my husband an ally, an ally of the South American, well, and North American, absolutely, indigenous people.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. One example we have for us, of course, is the example of Ruhiyyh Khanum. As I mentioned earlier, she's been given the title in the Baha'i faith of Hand of the Cause of God. So she's a real spiritual leader for the Baha'is. And after 1957, when her husband passed away, who was a leader of the Baha'i faith, she spent many years visiting indigenous peoples. And then in 1969, she wrote a letter back to them, a 30-page letter. And as part of the ignorance and passivity, very few Baha'i read this 30-page letter. But I think in this year, it'll rise up to the level of being one of those letters that we all study very carefully, because as indigenous allyship rises in priority for all Baha'is, this letter will be one that guide you. And the letter is remarkable. She talks about the indigenous homeland, that we're in your homeland. This notion of acknowledging that you're a guest here in whichever nation you happen to be a guest of. And you should always keep that to mind. She talks about their great cities. Anybody who lives in the DC area, you should cross over the Appalachians and go visit Chocaya. This city was like one of the largest cities in the entire world. It's where St. Louis is now built on top of, and you can still visit, sections of it have been preserved. But that language group, the Siouan language group from Chocaya, went all the way over the Appalachians to this whole region here. The language of the Monaccans is Siouan as well. And so that culture is just so massive from St. Louis all the way to Richmond. So that's a great city to help bring this letter to life for you. If you've not visited Chicaya before, I advise you to visit the largest city in North America. And praising their technologies. We talked about their amazing agricultural technologies that are so advanced that we all benefit from. And visiting, their methods of learning and knowledge, their temples. And like when I visited that cemetery at the western end of the Monacan Nation, it's the most beautiful cemetery I've ever seen in the world. It's on a mountain, and then they built a man-made mountain on top of the mountain, so you can see the beautiful view of like I've never seen. And so what a beautiful way to think of where to bury and treat your ancestors with respect. And all 9 of their current burial grounds are under danger. So one of my projects after Rasawek, their capital, is preserved. I want to help preserve some of those cemeteries so all the world can learn how beautiful are the Monacan cemeteries. And Ruhiyyh Khanum said, never feel in any way inferior. People all over the world are learning and need to learn from you. Remember, help us is the mantra you should keep in your mind as you're trying to be an Indigenous ally. You're not here to help them. It's help us, right? That puts you in a proper frame of mind to overcome the ignorance and the passivity. It's vital as standard bearers of our faith that we ally with them. And what she did is she completely replaced ignorance and passivity with affirmation and recognition. So everywhere, you should be making sure that your interaction with the Indigenous is to learn from them, to recognize them, to affirm them. It's the opposite of the tradition she was born in. She grew up in Montreal, Canada. I was at an ABS conference, an Association for Baha'i Studies conference that opened and said, we in Canada are 2 people, the French and the English. And here I was sitting beside Doug White of the Nanaimo First Nation. And here it was at Association Baha'i Studies conference saying, there's 2 people. Well, what about the 500 nations, Indigenous nations? You see, we have to take that at a front ground. The opposite of the tradition we're born in. She quoted Shoghi Effendi saying that the Indigenous will enrich us. Again, help us, not about help you. Human potential can only be reached when Indigenous are at the forefront of the cause and society. The forefront of the cause and society. So that's why that notion, when Shoghi Effendi said the Indigenous are the standard bearers of our faith, again, you had 9. None of us are the standard bearers. The Indigenous amongst us are. So if the Indigenous are standard bearers, we have to elevate their cultures to be at the forefront of our society, such as what Jen's sister is doing. And we have to be equal well-wishers, admire and respect their ancient descent, right? And feel that they will be interested as we are on working on a living religion together. Common shared enterprise, that notion of mutual advancement. And one very interesting thing that Ruhiyyh Khanum wrote in her letter, Baha'u'llah in all his sufferings, his exiles, his trials, states that Baha'u'llah has the fortitude of the Indigenous and not the weakness of the European descent man. I thought that's incredible. Ruhiyyh Khanum said Baha'u'llah has the fortitude of the Indigenous. Has anyone ever heard that before? You heard it from Ruhiyyh Khanum? Baha'u'llah. So every time I mention Baha'u'llah, we talk about one of his qualities, because many of us talk about Baha'u'llah as Baha'is. One of the things we should start saying is quoting from Amatul Ruhiyyh Khanum, that's saying Baha'u'llah has the fortitude of the Indigenous, not the weakness of the European descent man. Right? Because we're trying to overcome, we're trying to affirm and recognize the opposite of ignorance and passivity. And the most public example we have, the embodiment of the allyship, was described in, of course, the tablets of the divine plan, right? That whole notion of have to work on that. So we have a writing from Abdul Baha about this. We have the writing from Ruhiyyh Khanum. We have the writings of Shoghi Effendi on this topic. And of course, we have the example of Baha'u'llah, who exemplifies indigenous fortitude. Because this cause needs them. Humanity needs them. So we have an absolute vital need. Every day you see it more as you study how our world is. Indigenous leadership, their technologies, their culture, their spiritual standard to uphold the world. So they're not passive objects for us to teach. They're not passive objects for us to assimilate and give our culture to. Like in Puka Puka we heard, that's the first in the 500 years that the Spanish have been in South America. It took the Baha'is to establish the first school to be in the Quechua language. That's what I mean, affirming. So in each one of our states, you know, talk to some of the indigenous friends, and you'll find that all the languages, as Kevin Locke tells me, the languages that are strong are on crutches, and most of them are on life support. So everything you can just do to support indigenous instruction and keeping those languages alive, you should do, like learning them yourself, right? Pioneering, we always learn language where we are. Quechua learned Quechua, we all can. So one of the things, you know, when you look at this Keystone Pipeline right now, the whole world, you can see all the press, all the politicians, they're paralyzed. They don't know how to speak about indigenous issues, because even when they take away the Keystone Pipeline, they never know why they're doing this. They don't even know how to think about this, right? Like Montana Senator Steve Daines, he stated, removing the pipeline is a terrible mistake. And he wanted to talk about thousands of high-paying jobs from that. Assimilation, get a job in oil, forget about your culture, just get a job. Denial, I ignore your treaties. That's what the senator from Montana was saying. So the Baha'is, by leading in indigenous allyship, we can give them an answer. Why do we need to be allies? Because we need indigenous culture at the forefront as the protagonist of America. Because the Baha'i faith needs it to be our standard bearers, and the world needs it. We need the technologies, their ways of knowing, their ways of being to be at the forefront of our culture. So for Baha'is, there's no question as to why we do this. The standard bearer of faith. And a society is aware that it's a time for change, but they're paralyzed because they don't know why. So we, as Baha'is, by being allies, we can explain that why. Why do we have to preserve that indigenous cemetery for the Monaccans? Why do we have to preserve their capital city, Roswick, just a few miles from my home here? Because there's so much for us to learn. Ali Nakjavani spent 40 years on the Universal House of Justice as leading the Baha'i world. But despite 40 years, he still, before he went to meet with the indigenous of British Columbia for 2 days, he still prepared for that talk. How did he prepare? He called together some very knowledgeable individuals who have a lot of experience as indigenous allies. And he asked them, how can I be respectful? What does respectfulness look like amongst these nations? How to communicate in a meaningful way in these nations? How to gain understanding in these nations? So Ali Nakjavani, not even though for 40 years a member of the Universal House of Justice, he's still prepared to become a better indigenous ally. So if a House of Justice member takes preparation for that, certainly no one else has an excuse not to. Like by reading the 30-page letter Ruhiyyh Khanum provided for us as a guidepost to be an ally. And then, as we did on our last fireside that Jan was so kind to me, I always say you can show up, listen up, and stand up. Show up at native spaces. if their capital is threatened, if their land is threatened, show up, be there, listen up for the native voices. We have so much to learn. Growing up, as Reynaldo and myself agree, ignorant and passive, we need to learn from natives. So you have to actually start meeting some and listening to them. And Jan was so kind as to give a platform here in January for all of us here to learn more. We need more of that. And stand up in support of what they are doing. They're going to be the leaders. We need their culture to rise up. We have to stand behind them and let them know they're fully supported. So that's my thoughts I want to share tonight on Indigenous allyship and how it's influenced my life. And I hope it becomes part of all of yours as well.
Thank you so much, Lex. That was very inspiring. I think each one of us feels like we now need to rise up and to act upon your words. And it has just been so good to hear your reflections, the work that you have been doing to study, to interact, to be your own ally for Indigenous people. And you are an inspiration. That's all I can say. Thank you so very much. Now that I've embarrassed him enough, he has left. Are there any questions for Lex? I thought I embarrassed you when you left.
No.
Anyway, thank you so much, Lex. Are there, yeah, Ronaldo?
Not a question, Lex, but maybe an additional to what the three show up, stand up, listen up.
Yeah.
Allow me to suggest another alternative, which we can do even when we're far away from an indigenous group. If you look at what has happened in Bolivia, it is extremely interesting, the influx probable that the Baha'i faith has had on the first indigenous president of a country. Evo Morales came up to be president, which is unprecedented, absolutely unprecedented in any of the other cultures. It's like saying that the first African-American president, Barack Obama, came to be president in the US. This is the case in Bolivia. How much the influence of what he conceived to be his government in Bolivia came from teachings from the Baha'i faith, I have no idea. But what I do know is that the constitution that came about, a reformed constitution that came about in the country, had a principle that had never been stated in the constitution of Bolivia, and that was inclusiveness. It was the first time that it was acknowledged that 60% or over 60% of the population of Bolivia was actually indigenous people that had no rights. And so this conception that they had all the rights to have the same rights as the white people was a revolution. He got kicked out of the last election. Now, what can we do about that? I think one of the things that we can add is to celebrate in any way and measure. If we can celebrate things that are happening like that in any indigenous people, let us celebrate it in our communities. Let us come to a moment in which we will actually give thanks to God and celebrate what's happening there. Because otherwise, if we don't break this mental barrier that we have, that these people merit our attention and merit our respect, then we don't break up that attitude of ignorance and passivity. So one way I would suggest to add to your list is celebrate any triumph. Because it seems to me that partially the changes in the world for the unity of mankind are not going to come from Baha'is, are come to Baha'i-inspired people that will either assimilate the principles and put them into action, but that big step is not going to be done by Baha'is. But it is certainly going to be done in the spirit world, because Baha'u'llah has made that influx into humanity. And somehow that is being assimilated by people like persons like Evo Morales. So allow me to pitch that one in.
Well, yeah, I mean, two things. One, remember we heard Ruhiyyh Khanum tell us to affirm and recognize. So that's exactly what you were doing.
Yeah, thank you.
And so that's something we can all do, because that will do the opposite of passivity and ignorance. But I don't think you have to look at things separately. You know, as standard bearers of the faith, we need indigenous nations at the forefront of every society in every country. And so that's absolutely true, right? But that's also permits the standard bearers to also be our representatives of the faith at a more pronounced level. You know, so I think it goes together. You know, this dynamic is together. One thing I think that Lucho asked me, you know, one thing I taught my son was the obligatory prayer in Quechua. And so I just like, Jen, if you don't mind, if I could just say that prayer right now. I just want to, it's one of the things that brings a lot of joy to my heart. And if you don't mind, if I could say that.
Thank you.
No karikuni apu ya diusni kanri kurichi was kaiki taresi sunai paju pai chasun ai pache ched manataka Jani kunapa chamana atnios kaska takan manchaja tunati ni joy kaskaita mana imayosh kaskaiti china tashkancha tashkaskaita Manwaj a puyaya dio kanchukan mana astawa pichus manalim piana pakush pichus kash paila manta.
Thank you, Lex. That was wonderful. Other questions, comments? I want to thank Stephanie and Lucio also for sharing as well. And I hear stories like that, and I you know, the pioneering and the work that you've been doing, and all that Lex is doing, and other people I'm sure who are here as well. And when I hear things like that, I say to myself, how could I even call myself a Baha'i? I just really honor you. And Little Brave, I am so honored that you are here with us this evening. I expect some of you were here last month when Little Brave presented, and I was just so grateful and for your contribution, and honored that you would be here again this evening. Thank you.
Janice, don't say that. You're disappointing me. If you feel that way, how I feel, you make me feel so bad.
Okay, that's
Please, I know you will. You're doing your homage.
Yeah, I like to thank Janice also. This is the first time I ever come to know so much about, you know, yeah, especially that you quoted about the Ruhiyyh Khanum's letter, and I was just looking about it and looking. I come from Bangladesh, and now we are just started a beautiful project, and there are people who are becoming Baha'is. And young fellow, one time he did say something like, oh, we are so neglected. We feel, you know, when they come to city, they feel so much invisible, and that was paining. Now, today's fireside, I came across and I found these wonderful quotations that tomorrow in the Zoom in Bangladesh, I'm going to share and uplift the voice that Ruhiyyh Khanum and Guardian and Abdul Baha, and look at the writings they put. Thank you so much. Always so much to learn. And yes, we always thought about Aborigines, always we use the word Aborigines, indigenous and natives, and they never give a name like, and so to me, even the word we use, for example, the word we use, Aborigines or indigenous, has a stamp on their recognition of being a primitive, of being not civilized, of being illiterate, of being not knowledgeful. But it's the other way around. You're so right. We have to open. Yeah, it's so right. Thank you for bringing that. Help me, not help them. It's yeah.
Help us,
Thank you.
mantra.
Lex, I sent you a question. Did you get that?
No, I haven't been following the chat. I am so sorry.
Oh, no, I sent the question to Lex directly. It was a simple
I
question.
want to comment one thing on what Nargis said before you go to the question. But
Okay.
my friend Emiliano is here from Tucson, Arizona, and we had a very interesting experience there, just to show how this denial manifests itself. So we're living in Tucson, and we had a lot of Mexicans living with us. And so the word for being someone who's very unintelligent and ignorant in Mexican Spanish is indio, ser indio. And I said to a person there, I said, excuse me, you realize you just used the word indigenous to imply stupid. And they said, no, I didn't. I don't want to offend anyone. I said, you just said ser indio. And they said it their whole life. So it's not even conscious. It wasn't even in the realm of consciousness. It was behind subconscious statement.
Yeah.
And so, Emiliana, I don't know if you had any experiences down there, let alone the Yuma and the Pima Indians who were right around us, but I just felt that was my first experience with a large amount of Mexicans, and just seeing how they themselves, a country so proud with the Aztecs, to have brought the view of their indigenous population so low.
Yeah, thanks, Lex. Actually, I live up in Phoenix now, and I actually serve and work with the Acamel Atam and Maricopa Peeposh peoples just south of Phoenix in the Pima community, the Gila River Indian community. And yeah, so lovely presentation. I really love that you referred to the letter from Ruhiyyh Khanum, because really it's such good guidance, especially if you're considering living on and or serving indigenous communities. And yeah, there's so much ingrained prejudice and I guess just white supremacy that we carry in our everyday lives that has really erased so much indigeneity in our lives. And so I would just, having served for 10 years in an indigenous community, and having had many Baha'is, lovely, wonderful Baha'is, just like you, wanting to come in and serve the indigenous folks, I really would encourage you all to consider the personal work that it takes to be prepared to go in and serve a community that has experienced so many generations of trauma. And even though I think that you will think that you've done some of the work to really eliminate some of the prejudices that you have, I guarantee you haven't. So you got to work harder. And for me, it took 10 years to get to a place where I'm barely scratching the surface. The tip of an iceberg is showing for me in regards to letting go of my own ego and really allowing for this, what Lex put so beautifully into words here, was that we really need to bring them to the forefront, because we as a Baha'i community need them to lead us. And so that takes putting aside your ego. It took me 10 years of 40 hours a day plus being in a community with youth and recognizing that, okay, I don't have anything to bring and they have everything to bring at this moment. So it took a lot of work, and I just would ask, because my team were so, and I'll keep it shorter, sorry. There are only like 7 communities of people that are really serving indigenous communities that I know of in the United States. And I know because we've come together many occasions to work together. And so there are so few champions out there. And a lot of times it's because friends come in with ideas and they forget that they need to really leave their ideas at the door and just be there to serve. So I would just encourage everyone to do the internal work that really needs to get done to help take care of the space that needs to be held so that Indigenous folks can really shine for our nation.
Emiliano, is that 7 Baha'i projects or 7 in general that you spoke of?
It's a rough number. It's like 7 communities where teams are working on expanding Indigenous the process, the institute process in Indigenous communities. There's essentially 7 groups, and we were brought together by Natasha Bruce, our continental counselor, to really develop spaces for each other to reflect and work together because there's so few. It was hard. It's in Arizona. It's us and the Native American Baha'i Institute, right? And we have one of the highest number of Indigenous peoples and tribal communities in the nation here in Arizona. So there's 2 of us, 2 groups of us that are essentially doing anything, and that's too few,
Thanks, Emiliano.
Yes,
Thanks so
thank
much.
you very much. Thank you.
Behnaz, I know you had a question. Do you want to go ahead?
Yes. My question was, are there a lot of, is the Baha'i faith has spread a lot in Indigenous groups, or how are we doing in terms of attracting them to the faith of Baha'i?
I'll repeat what I said at the beginning, Behnaz. I am just ignorant. So there's many wonderful Baha'is of Indigenous background who could speak to those answers, but I'm not in a position to answer that.
So we don't know how many or how much.
I'm sure people know, not myself.
Okay. Very good. Enjoyed
your
it.
Your question, Behnaz, was how many Indigenous American Baha'is are there? Is that what?
Yes.
It's a very good question. That'd be a good.
Of course. Behnaz, we should always think about 500 nations, right?
Emiliano, you had your hand up.
We don't think of it as Indigenous. There's so many groups. Like here, just in my area where I'm living, here's the Monacan, which my wife is from that nation. But then just over here, you have specific groups. So I think one good start is starting to break apart the 500 nations and getting to know those around you, and so that way you don't think that all, the same way we don't say Africa, you're from Africa. Well, are you from Benin, or are you from Zambia? Are you from Angola? Are you from Kenya? In the same way with Indigenous, which nation? Each nation's different, has different customs, and it's great to get to know all the richness of all 500.
Yeah, but I thought maybe there is a statistic about the total number of Baha'i all over the world, and within that there must be, division, that how many are from each country or from each section. I mean, I'm sure that the statistic exists somewhere, but we just don't know that.
Remember, Behnaz, when I first was in Washington, D.C., I said, where's the Baha'i historian to tell me where Abdu'l-Baha was in the city? And the person laughed at me and said, the Baha'i faith does not have professional paid historians. If you want to know, go find it. So I spent the next 30 years finding the answer. So Behnaz, that's a good challenge for you. Go find out the number of every single one of the 500 nations. Who's the name of the first Baha'i man and first Baha'i woman in each nation? That's a good project.
Also, you can ask the archive department in National. You can communicate, and they may have something that you are looking for.
Awesome. I should
just curious. That's okay.
A wonderful friend of the faith, and has been a friend for a long time, for which we are so grateful. So if one of us can find that information, send it to me, and I'll be sure that Behnaz.
That's okay. I was just curious, I mean, the more important thing is that I learned a lot from Lex's presentation tonight, and I thank you for that.
Thank you, Behnaz. It is always wonderful to see you. I know that we have people that haven't been here before, and if you would like to get on the notification list and wouldn't mind putting your email address in the chat, I will be sure that you are on the email list. You might be interested to know that Ronaldo Pareja is going to be our speaker for next month. And did you know that, Ronaldo?
I am beginning to know.
I'm not going to let you forget. So, but anyway, I didn't want to, I would love to continue the conversation. I don't want to cut the conversation off. So
we have to make sure to have a lot of questions for him, because he always asks a lot of questions.
and I still have one more. If Lex is not in disagreement.
You put your hand up a couple of times.
Lex, can you repeat the phrase that that really intrigues me how to go about understanding it? You said the indigenous people should come to be at the forefront of, can you repeat that?
Forefront of society, like
okay, you know, I got it. The question is the following. We have now what?
Can I interrupt for a minute, Ronaldo, just for 1 minute? Emiliano has had his hand up for quite a while, so I want to give him an opportunity to ask his question and make a comment, and then we'll come back.
I'll make it so brief. There are so few indigenous Baha'is in the United States that when someone declares, it is sent to the Baha'i National Center and sent to the World Center to be celebrated. There are so few.
Thank you, Emiliano. Okay, Ronaldo, my apologies for interrupting.
You're the lady that has the whip to keep us in order. We abide by.
I'm not very good at this, you know that.
Oh, you're terrific, my dear. Coming back, Lex, at least what we have general history knowledge is the indigenous people have been at least oppressed, what, 250 years, 350 years in the United States, since more or less. In all that historical period, much of their culture, their belief system, their self-assurance as a nation, their history, their tradition has been blotted out, buried, destroyed, not acknowledged. How do you foresee that these indigenous people with that richness background can actually resuscitate that which is needed to become the forefront? Because I see that it must be a process of some sort for that to arise and become what you're predicting that it should become.
Well, let's take the example of Kevin Locke, you know, and I think you should, maybe Jan can have him come and speak here, because you know, to Emiliano's point, you know, the suicide rate on Standing Rock reservations, 25%. Can you picture a 25% suicide rate? That's hopelessness. And when you see Kevin, he knows the name of every valley, every hill, every mound that you walk all across his land. And right away, you say, Kevin, how do you know so much? He's learned from his elders. It was illegal to practice his religion until 1979. So thank God, some of the elders kept that knowledge alive so Kevin could learn these things. And Kevin gives an inipi every weekend, and you can go there to his inipi and learn from him just as he teaches his nation. And so I can't speak to that. Again, we have to start going to the indigenous experts to learn from them. You know, non-indigenous should not be speaking to how indigenous will preserve and forward the language. We need to learn from them. So there's many brilliant Baha'i indigenous who we should learn more from. So I will defer to that question. I can only speak to allyship, which is the job that we all have. And we can do that by, as you said, affirm and recognize indigenous culture. So support those novelists. I today finished a novel by a wonderful Ontario indigenous author. And I thanked him, you know, on social media for his book, because it was so great to read a book where the indigenous people are the protagonists not like the Constitution, which says they're savages. But I thanked him and he responded right away. And I asked him, can I amplify your voice by putting you on my podcast? And he said, okay. And we're going to discuss interracial allyship together, you see? So that's, I think, where we have to put our focus is on our job as allies and listen to them about things like you're talking about cultural preservation, cultural renaissance. And of course, Kevin Locke is, and his mother, Patricia Locke, are examples because they've done so much to preserve language, preserve culture, preserve so much. There's so much to learn from individuals like Kevin and others.
Thank you.
Janice, could I suggest or ask that maybe Emiliano help answer that question also, if he's still there, if he's willing?
Emiliano, yes, he is. Would you be willing to help us?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? Because I had to plug my computer in.
I don't know who had the question. Maybe the person who voiced it could ask it again.
How about Lex, if you make the resume, your understanding of my question, so that I don't distort it too much.
Emiliano, he's asking, given the challenges in the genocide, the assimilation that we've talked about, how is their culture going to be brought to the forefront and rebuilt and amplified?
So you're asking a question that we've never seen before. And my only answer would be that in serving the Akuma Atom youth and the Pipash youth that I serve through the institute process, through the junior youth program, children's classes, and the the Rúhíyyih Institute and devotions, that there's magic there. There's spiritual power there, let's say that. And that's what we have never seen it before. It's 400 years, none of us have been alive when the indigenous peoples had a voice, were the protagonists in their community. We've never seen that. So here we are holding a space so that they can do the work to heal themselves, to explore what healing means. And when that healing comes, when they are that when that space is able to be held for them, and for them to explore that indigenous their indigenous background with the words of Baha'u'llah, that's where the answer is going to come from. So I don't know what it looks like. I'm just holding space, and that's really all I can do. But if I had enough time to tell you about all the joy, love, and experiences that I had working with these youth and what I see them being able to do, they will move Phoenix. They will move our state here. A lot of times friends talk about this point on a tablecloth. And if this point right here is the indigenous youth of the Gila River Indian community, and they're able to pick and lift themselves up, everything else comes up with the tablecloth. They will uplift the whole of society, the whole fabric of the community. So I don't know what that looks like, really, what it's going to look like, but it's going to be done with joy. It'll be done with reverence, with spirit, with just beauty. And I'm looking forward to it. So I will dedicate myself to that process so that maybe I can catch a glimpse of it. Yeah.
Thanks, Emiliano, because that really ties up to the invitation of the Universal House of Justice to put the core activities up in the forefront of our service. Thank you. That really
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Anyone else?
How about a round of applause like Lex merits?
Lex, thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time to be here with us, for all the preparation you did, and sharing all of your insights, and just uplifting us all and helping to advance our understanding. Thank you so much. Now I'm going to stop the recording. Anybody who would like to stay on and have an informal chat, that is perfectly fine. I'm just going to stop the recording so that we can get real.
I just want to say something. Quechua language, and the Quechua language is never goodbye. It's never like in Spanish or English, goodbye, or Fidense, whatever. In Quechua, it's always a hope. When you're going to say goodbye, you say Rikukuna kama. That means until we see each other. Tinkuna kama, until we encounter again. So it's always a hope. It's always tomorrow. So all of you, nice to see you in Tinkukuna kama.
Tinkukuna kama.
Beautiful. We'll meet again.
I see
very
Erwin.
much.
I see Erwin there.
Enjoyed
Erwin,
it.
I haven't
Okay.
been in your space in a long time. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Can you see me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I didn't prepare myself with, the light in front of
Hi,
me.
Erwin.
Hello. How are you guys? Hey, as the resident statistician, I was Googling for Benaz's sake, the percentage of Native or First Nation Baha'is. I could not come up with a good number of the US, but the Canadian Baha'i community says that 18% of Canadian Baha'is come from First Nations and Intuit backgrounds. That's quite a high number.
That is high number.
18%
Impressive.
of Canadian Baha'is.
Impressive.
Not a good number for the US. The statistics are a little less clear with the US. However, I did find a map where they have the proportion of, I guess, the density of the Baha'i population. And it was interesting because the two states that stood out were South Carolina and the Dakotas. So that tells me there's probably a pretty high percentage in the US as well of First Nations, I'm guessing.
And I think that's particularly impressive because I think, I may be wrong about this, but I think probably indigenous people are more attached to their, centuries long time own traditions, own faith. So if they have, become interested and have become Baha'i, that just tells you something about how wonderful Baha'i faith is.
Yeah, and I think the other appeal maybe for some First Nations, and maybe Lex or somebody else would know more, I have heard that some of the tribes or the nations actually, when they heard about the Baha'i faith, the word Baha'i was very significant. It was in their traditions that they were waiting for. And so there was a lot of enrollment because of the fulfillment of their prophecies.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Thank you, Erin. I wanted to get that on the recording, so I'm going to stop it now, but thank you for offering that.
So I guess you're going to quote me on that.